Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this Munitionsschlepper. This is a 72nd scale kit from Hobby Boss, which was kindly gifted to me by a viewer, Hurcheon, and I would like to say a very big thank you. It was a surprise when it showed up in my PO box, and I really appreciate it. It brightened my day quite a bit. As we saw at the end of the Hobby Boss Morse Karl video, this vehicle will compliment Karl. It will say nice things like, "Oh, your tracks look good today, Karl," or maybe it just schleps munitions for Karl. I don't know, I'm not a historian. Anyway, inside the box we find some plastic. Oh boy, what a surprise! This lower hull part is quite nice looking. It's got the suspension for the road wheels all built in, which I think is a good feature. It should give this a fairly good amount of strength. This kit does have rubber band tracks, and when it comes to rubber band tracks, the stronger the suspension, the better. This piece of upper hull is also a single part, though there isn't much to say about it. This sprue has the various bits of crane and ammo holding compartment, and enough ammo to fill said compartment, that being a whopping 4 rounds. I guess for rounds that big, 4 is a lot. The detailing here is pretty good. I mean, I'm no munitionschlepperologist, so I'm not going to claim to know if it is or isn't accurate, but it's fairly well detailed. There's various rivets, bolts and doodads, and they're pretty neat and crisp. Who doesn't like a nice crisp rivet? There are of course mold lines, and a little bit of flash here and there, but nothing too severe. It should be very easy to deal with your knife, just like any other problem. Some of the parts here are quite small, like the headlamps, and that will make them a little bit fiddly to deal with, but I wouldn't say there's anything here that's overly troublesome. Here are the dreaded rubber band tracks. Much like the Karl I built the other week, these are kind of annoying to deal with, and seem to be resistant to superglue. They do look fairly decent, and the detail on them is nice enough. I'm pretty sure if you saw the Karl video, and the build stream for this kit, you've already heard me whine about these tracks enough. Unsurprisingly, the kit comes with instructions. These are pretty decent, and they are the kind that are stapled in the middle, which I like. The diagrams are well laid out, and easy to understand and follow. I don't think there was anything here that caused me any real confusion. Oh, that's rare. Quiet you. Okay, the gluing together of bits of plastic shall now commence. First, I glue the drive sprockets together. There's a piece of D-shaped keying here, and you would be forgiven for thinking that might be a piece of scrap that needs to be removed, but it's not. It helps guide the two halves of the sprocket together, though a bit of pressure was needed to force both halves all the way together. I then glue the idler wheels together. These are also keyed so the spokes will line up with each other. You might think it's now time to stick those onto the hull, but it isn't. You've been tricked. It's actually time to attach the hull rear, but before we can do that, there's some holes that need to be made. These are actually meant to be square holes, but I don't have a square drill, so after drilling round holes, I use my knife to kajigger them so they're square-ish. These don't have to be the neatest, because the parts that'll be mounted here should cover them up. I follow that by gluing on this lower rear plate. While that bonds into place, I add I'm assuming this is a muffler. This is the one I had to drill holes for. I don't see why they couldn't make the pegs for this round. Maybe there's some sort of model kit designing magic at play here that's well beyond my comprehension. I guess what matters is it's on now. I then add a second muffler. Munitionsschleppers can have a second muffler, as a treat. The results look pretty decent, and you can't even tell the mounting holes I made were a bit messy. I then install that plate, and it more or less just drops into place. To make sure it stays there, I add some glue. Gluing on the inside where you can is usually a pretty good idea. It should help reduce the risk of any glue-related mess. I then add a pair of hooks to the sides of the hull here, presumably for hooking things. There is a little bit of play here, so you might need to do a bit of nudging. Next, I add the road wheels. Most kits would have you put the wheels together before putting them onto the tank, but not this one. You add them both to the axles like so, easy as can be. It is probably a good idea to make sure you've got the wheels around the right way though. That shouldn't be too much of a challenge. Eventually all the road wheels are in place and they do look pretty good, and it was very easy to get them all lined up nice and straight. I mean, there are a couple that are slightly wonky, but not enough to be a real problem. I then add the drive sprockets. That piece of D-shaped keying I mentioned earlier acts as the axle here. Good thing I didn't cut that off. it makes sense to follow that with the idler wheels, and these are also pretty easy to put on. Return rollers come next, and these are also pretty simple to install. They did have the most play out of all the wheels, so you might need to do a bit more nudging to get them nice and straight. The mounting pin is fairly strong here, which is good. These shouldn't break when you try to install the tracks, which is magically done, just like that.
You forgot to press record, didn't you?
Yes. Rest assured though, these weren't fun to put on. They seem to be resistant to superglue, and they're a little bit tighter than they really should be. I have been told a few times that you can staple these, though at 72nd scale, staples are kind of big and not always easy to hide. Anyway, the tracks are on and I can move on. It's time to add this piece of upper hull, the plate that goes over the transmission. This goes into place fairly easily. I then add these brackets to the lower front plate. I think I've got them on right, slightly tilting inward. It's how it looked like the instructions wanted them anyway. The side mudguardy doodads go on next, and these have some handy dandy guide tabs that will help you get the right positioning. Just be careful to avoid knocking the tracks off. You may have to apply some pressure to get them to stay all the way up against the hull, but I'm sure you can deal with that. Why not put the upper hull part on next? You'll need to apply some pressure here too, in order to minimize any unwanted gaps. Nobody wants unwanted gaps. That's why they're called unwanted gaps. Next, I add this platform, which is for standing on, but only if you're a 72nd scale person. You're probably a 1:1 scale person, so don't stand on it. You might need to eyeball this so it doesn't go on at a weird angle, but that's pretty easy. I then add this tool, and I assume this is related to the crane. There isn't anything to guide this, so I just kind of put it where the instructions seem to show it, and added glue. This jack comes next. There's a couple of guide slots for it, and it pretty much just plops right into place. Just behind that, I install what I think is a fire extinguisher. You might find tweezers to be quite helpful for this kind of thing. These tweezers were sent to me by 9 Steps Industries, and I think they're really good. If you're looking for some nice new tweezers or other hobby tools, you can use code Herbert20 in the 9 Steps store for 20% off. Link in the description. You might also find tweezers helpful for these tiny little headlamps. They do go on relatively easily though, and I think they look rather good. So that the crew can climb up the side of the hull a bit easier, there's a little ladder. Would you call this a ladder? A stirrup? A step? Whatever you'd call it, it's not too difficult to install, but it is thin, and probably quite easy to break. So, don't break it. Another presumed fire extinguisher goes here, and it's just as easy to put on as the first one is. I follow that by installing the no-tech covered light. As with the other small parts, it's made fiddly by its size. You'll probably have to do a bit of fiddling and nudging here, and again, tweezers might help. On the rear of the hull, I add this platform. This is a bit bigger than the one on the side, but that doesn't mean you should stand on it. It's still only for 72nd scale people. Then, this little box goes on the hull side here. There's a nice big square guide for it, which makes this nice and easy. Next, I add these two, bulges? I've no idea what these are. Maybe they're air intakes, or perhaps sauerkraut containers. They go into place nice and easy, thanks to the big rectangular bits of keying. There is also meant to be another piece of detail here at the rear. Unfortunately, it was eaten by the carpet monster. Now, why not show how the ammo goes together? I'm not actually going to use this, and I think this might be the smaller 540mm ammo instead of the 600mm rounds my Karl would fire, but it is still nice to have. Assembly is simple. You glue this bottom part into place, and that's it. The ammo should sit in the storage box thing like so, and as you can probably see, there's enough room for 4 rounds. Unfortunately, this kit wasn't really designed to have the ammo compartment modelled open, so I'm not going to bother putting shells inside, and it wouldn't really make much sense to model one on the crane either. A positive though is that building the ammo box is pretty simple. There are 2 side walls that go into place easily, just make sure you've got them around the right way and you'll be fine. The top goes on just about as easily, though I wouldn't apply too much pressure to it. I was concerned that if I did so, it might fall into the compartment, and that would be an inconvenience. The compartment top is why I didn't model it open, but it would require a fair bit of cutting and messing around to do that. The reason being that the top doesn't just flop open in one big piece, it is, in reality, multiple pieces. It's not a big deal really, and it does look pretty good closed. There's a slot into which another platform is added.
Please don't use the same dumb joke for the third time.
If you count the Karl video, it would be the fourth or fifth time. Installing the ammo compartment onto the hull is pretty easy, though it did take quite a bit of pressure and kajiggering to get it all the way into place. I think friction alone probably would have held this in place, but I added glue just to be sure, and of course, to avoid a smiting by the glue god. Then, there's some handles for the platform at the rear. The instructions say to put these on before putting the ammo compartment assembly on the hull, but I figured doing it now would avoid any potential damage to these small parts. I would imagine they'd be easy to break. It is now crane time. I start with this tiny doodad, which gets glued onto this frame, I guess you might call it. Then these two parts go together to form a sort of tub-like assembly. While those are bonding, I glue these two small thin parts into this larger, also frame, I guess. These are two different parts, so do be sure that you're putting the right part in the right place. Otherwise, it'll be wrong. And we all know that having little bits of plastic around the wrong way is the biggest crime imaginable. Then, onto that assembly, I glue the whatever it is that I described as tub-like. I then glue that onto this bottom part. This has a little nubbin that will go into the hull and lock the crane body into place. I believe this thing here is the drum for the crane's cable. The winch part? I don't know. There's a hole in the tub thing for it to mount into, though I guess it's not really a tub anymore, is it? There's nothing for the other end of this to fit into, so you do have to kind of eyeball the positioning. Next to that there's a little rectangle into which we mount the first crane doohickey that I put together. Simple enough. Behind that we add this thing, which probably has a name, followed by this larger component, some sort of machinery enclosure. It did take a little bit of pressure to get this to sit properly. I would suggest if you're applying pressure, being careful to avoid damaging the smaller bits we just glued on. Then, in front of the cable drum, if that is indeed what it is, I add this little thing. This seems to be some sort of cable rolling implement. I then make a little control handle, which is comprised of three very small parts. This pole with a little thing that goes on top, and then the very small control wheel. It is obviously a bit fiddly to get all of this together nice and straight, but it's not impossible. I follow that with a table.
Are you sure that's a table?
No, I'm not. I'm pretty sure it's actually the operator's seat, but it does look a bit like a table. It also looks uncomfortable to sit on. The legs on one side of this are slightly longer, and those are the legs that should go in the mounting holes. The control wheel assembly can then be mounted in front of the table chair thing. There's a convenient recess into which this mounts, and it is of course made a bit easier with the use of tweezers. On the side I add this little lever assembly. I'm not totally sure, but I think I got this in the right position. On the other side I add this cylinder, which I think is the winch motor. There's a very small handle that goes just behind that, and you'll probably have to do a bit of nudging to get that to look neat and straight. Then there's a cover for that cylinder thing I just added. I guess it's important or dangerous enough to cover. There isn't much in the way of keying for this, so again, you'll have to do a bit of the old eyeball and nudge until it looks right. Now I start working on the craney part of the crane. I glue together this doohickey, doing my best to keep it all nice and straight. Then, it's time to work on the mast. You should be used to me not knowing the names of the parts by now. Anyway, I wanted to model this with the crane folded down, like it shows on the box. The instructions don't actually tell you how to do that, so I figured it out myself. These two parts are a sort of hinge at the base of the mast, and the instructions say to glue them together. They won't hinge if you do that, so instead, I figured out which was the top and which was the bottom, and I glued the mast onto the top part. I figured now was as good a time as any to attach the base of the crane to the hull. I thought it would just drop into place with its little locking tab mechanism. And I was wrong. It took quite a bit of force to get it to rotate around, and I was very concerned that I was going to break something. Fortunately, I didn't. Once I got it where I wanted it, I added glue. On top of that, I glued the lower half of the mast hinge thing. There's nothing too tricky here, just make sure that it goes together in such a way that the hinge will hinge along the length of the vehicle and not to the side. Something like this. Then I tried to glue the little whatever it's called that I assembled a moment ago onto the mast. The keying here didn't really work properly, so I trimmed that off, which meant that I had to eyeball the fit, but I think I got it close enough to where it should be. Next, I glued together the little pulley wheel doovers for the top end of the crane. I figured it made sense to then glue that onto the end of the boom. The pulley part does have a bit of an angle to it, and I'm not totally sure I got this around the right way, but I think I did. There's a couple of other wheels that go onto the sides of the pulley part, and these are pretty simple to put on. I did have to do a bit of nudging to get them to look neat and relatively straight, but you should be used to that by now. There's also another similar wheel that goes on the outside of the pulley on top of the mast, and on the other side of that, a little arm thing. I've sort of guessed at the correct positioning for this, so it's probably wrong. Anyway, it's now time to add both of these assemblies to the model. Because I'm building mine as folded down, it's just a matter of laying the boom down across the ammo compartment, and then I use the mast to make sure that the boom is in the right spot. And then I just sort of tip it down rearward, obviously making sure there's enough glue where the parts contact each other. I'm not sure that it's 100% realistic, but it looks the part to me. The kit is obviously kind of designed to do this, so I didn't have to make any major modifications, only disregard the instructions a bit. Next, I put the ammo handling tool together, the claw, or whatever you might like to call it. There are two parts for the hooky bit, and I did kind of make a bit of a mess of it, though it's not too difficult. Then, onto each end of the bar, I add the clampy bits that will hold onto the shells. Then I ponder how it should go onto the hull. The picture on the box shows it mounted here, with an extra support bracket underneath it. I couldn't find one of those on the sprues, and it's kind of obvious that this is intended to be strung up on the end of the crane, modelled in use. I didn't want that, and I ended the build stream here. And then I was a bit lazy in videoing what I was doing, but I did use the included string for crane cables. Not only did I have trouble undoing the knot that this was tied in, but it was kind of frizzy, and cables aren't usually this frizzy. Not cables that are deemed safe to use anyway. At any rate, I got a long enough piece of string and strung it up. It's certainly not the best rigging job. The cable doesn't wrap around the drum, and I'm not sure that it's in the right place along the length of the crane, and it also stops in the top pulley. It should probably continue back down the boom to the drum again, but I got sick of putting the cable on, so I cut it short. In an effort to make the string look a bit less frizzy, I added super glue to it, and it looks kind of bad near the hook, though it does look okay along the rest of the cable. After carefully cutting it from the loading grabber thingy, I glued the hook into place so that it looks like it's hooked onto something on the rear of the hull. This was partially to hide how messed up it looked, but also I figured it just kind of made sense. Cutting the hook from the top of the ammo grabber thing did work, but it was at the cost of the top of the ammo clamp, which the hook part would hook into. I just couldn't save it. It would have been nice if the hook was separate from the grabber. I glue the ammo grabber onto the front of the hull without the extra support bracket thing that would prop it up so that it was sitting horizontally. You could probably scratch build something for this, but I didn't feel like it was that important. Same with the top part that the hook goes into. If anybody asks, it was damaged, and Hans is on his way back with a replacement part right now. Anyway, the Hobby Boss Munitionsschlepper Panzer IV Ausführung D/E in 72nd scale is now completed and ready to feed ammo to Karl. I'm pretty happy with how this has turned out, at least for the most part. I'm not super happy with the cabling, though in fairness I guess I did do a sort of half-assed job with it, and I think finding a better, finer cable to use would have yielded a much better result, but I used what the kit supplied, as I usually do. It's only super glued into place, so it shouldn't be too difficult to replace the cables later on if I really want to. So other than that, I think it looks pretty good. I'm especially happy that I was able to model it folded down. The main reason I wanted to do that is because the ammo compartment can't be modelled open, not without a bunch of extra effort anyway, so I thought it would make sense to model this as though it was in transit. Also, the box does show it that way, which I think is kind of odd if it's not meant to be built that way. Anyway, it's a pretty decent model of a very interesting piece of equipment. If you've been around my channel for a while, you'll know that I enjoy odd vehicles like this, and I did rather enjoy this build. Obviously I'm not a big fan of the rubber band tracks, but it could be worse. The rest of the build was quite pleasant. I would like to say another big thank you to Hurcheon for sending me this kit. It was a very kind thing to do. I don't ask for kits to be sent, and I would really prefer people to buy kits for themselves to enjoy. But if you insist on sending me something, or you really want me to build a particular kit for whatever reason, my PO box is in the description below. Also, I did briefly mention it in the video, but the tweezers and knife and, if I sanded anything, the sanding sticks I used in this video were sent to me by 9 Steps Industries. If you're looking for tools, especially if you also happen to be in Australia, you can get 20% off if you use code HERBERT20 in their store. There's a link for that in the description too. Okay, enough of that. If you've got any questions or comments, put them in the comment section below. If you'd like to watch me build kits like this one live, go check out my Twitch channel, which is where I live stream pretty much everything you see on this channel. The link is also in the description. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell if you want to see more, and if you'd like to see my videos a bit early, as well as helping me to not starve, consider becoming a patron or a monthly member on Ko-fi. You can find links to Patreon, Ko-fi, and all of my other things like Discord and social media in the description below. Take care of yourselves, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.